On the podcast is former Washington Post writer and editor David Rowell. His book is titled The Endless Refrain: Memory, Nostalgia, and the Threat to New Music. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. Glad to be here.
The very first sentence in the book is the question, do we even want new music anymore? And you go on to tell the story behind this question. It entered your mind when you were, I think you're at a pub in Maine, I believe. Talk about this.
Yeah.
This is when the idea for the book came about.
Yeah, that's true. So I was accompanying my oldest friend, guitarist, singer, songwriter, and he had financed his own CD. So he had his first bit of new music, and he'd never been to New England, but somehow he put a string of dates of New England together. And so I was curious to see what would happen. So I went with him. And some of those nights were pretty tough slogs. I mean, he'd be put in a sports bar, he'd be put under a television that had ESPN. Sometimes he'd be playing for five people. And this particular night, it was a restaurant that had live music, and he had gone about 45 minutes without anyone applauding. It's like you just feel that. If you're the one performing, or you're the one person who's paying attention to those things. So I was a little more worked up about that than he was, but he was booked for a 3-hour set. And to make that set go, because he only had so many original songs, he was going to throw in a couple of cover songs. And so he said, I'm going to play a cover of a Tom Petty tune right now. Now, he didn't mean it to be ironic by choosing You Don't Know How It Feels, but that's sure what came through to me. And the thing that was so remarkable was that in that moment, everyone stopped what they were doing. I mean, no one had been paying attention whatsoever. Now the wait staff stopped, and everyone who was talking stopped their conversation because in those opening chords, they recognized this song, that we've heard more times than we've brushed our teeth. And so for a minute, it was just so mysterious because it was so dramatic. And what I realized was that they were all in rapture because it was a song they finally knew. And, so on some level, they had been listening. They had been listening enough to know that this was the music they were hearing wasn't anything new. And so they tuned him out. But they heard, here's a Tom Petty song, and they heard the familiar chords. So they were so into it. And the guy next to me was keeping time on the bar, and everyone went crazy when he was finished. And then he went back to introducing a new original song. And it was like those 4 minutes had never happened. And it was so strange and dramatic. And so there at the bar in my notebook, I wrote, do we even want new music anymore? And so that's the driving question for the whole book. And I kind of became obsessed with that question increasingly because I felt like I knew the answer, and the answer troubled me so much.
The answer to that question also depends on your age. Like, at what age do we stop wanting new music?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right about that. But in my experience, and I should say the whole book is my point of view, my experience, the way I am experiencing the musical landscape around me. But I think that age has gotten a lot lower that wants new music the way it once did. When I know I was born in '67, and when I was a teenager, I couldn't get enough of new music. But there are a couple of things going on here. I think that I am of a generation that when we started having children, it was really important to introduce our children to the music we love. And I know that I did that because I would drive around with my sons and say, okay, here's the Beatles Revolver album. And we can talk a little bit, but mostly we're just going to listen. And I felt like this was hugely important. I felt as strongly about this as like getting them vaccinated. It's like it was really important to me to give them a musical foundation of music that no way around it that I thought was great. And I think that's different because my parents never sat me down and said, we really want you to listen to this Perry Como,
Right.
And so I think in part it's the generation that grew up on MTV for whom music it just became much a bigger part of our daily life, I think. But to your question, I think young people are still discovering new music, but I think that a lot of the music they listen to is the music that they were raised on too, and that's not music of their generation.
How much of it is because of radio? Radio's changed because when I grew up, new music came to me through the radio. That's how I was going to determine whether I wanted to get into a new band or not. And MTV, of course.
Right, right.
But I don't think younger kids go to the radio anymore.
Oh
So
no, no. The idea, yeah, it's you get in the car and they get their streaming devices going. So the idea of making discoveries through radio is completely gone. They make it through video games, and they make it through, the very biggest way I think is they make it through the way that the streaming services silo us in. So if you listen to, like, if you're on Spotify and you listen to a song or an artist, then it what it wants you to do is stay very close to where you are. So it's not going to suddenly say, okay, now for some Brazilian pop. I mean, it's very mindful. It has all the metadata of the song you just heard, and so you're gonna next get a song generally has the same tempo, the same kind of instrumentation, the same kind of lyrical content, the same kind of vibe. And that's for me, that's the real danger of streaming services is just there's a sameness. And you can break out of that, I mean, but you have to be so willful and intentional about making discoveries, and that means going out on your own and finding them.
I noticed that with Spotify. I have Spotify, and if I listen to, say, an entire Tom Petty album, when the album's completed, they then offer up artists that are like Tom Petty in
That's right.
that
That's
genre.
right.
So it's suggesting what they think you want to hear.
Well, they don't want you to leave Spotify. They don't want the disruption. So if you keep listening to the same kind of music, if suddenly you heard death metal after Tom Petty, then that's a disruption for you. So you may not want to stay on Spotify at that point. You may be so thrown that you may go do something else, or you may go stream somewhere else. So the whole idea is to keep you where you are.
Yeah, they have something interesting on Spotify, which I admit I enjoy, and I'm wondering how they're able to go about and find out all the songs that I love. I think it's called, boy, there's a certain name of it, a certain playlist. Let me see if I can find it here. It's not liked songs, it's called something else.
Hmm.
It zeroes in on your age. I mean, it plays everything from the 80s for me and early
Yeah.
90s. It'll go everything
Yeah.
from like early 80s to early 90s. I'll find
Right.
it here, but yeah, it's fascinating how it does that. That's based on algorithms. Is it also taking from what you're looking up on online on the internet? I mean, I guess it could
I mean,
do that.
how Spotify works is very guarded, and so I certainly can't claim to know all their secrets. I don't. I think that there are good things that can come from listening to a streaming service like Spotify, but I think there is a danger too. And personally, for what it's worth, I don't listen to streaming. I don't listen to music through streaming services,
Okay.
and here's why: because you haven't made as much an investment in the album if you're streaming it. You haven't bought the album or you haven't bought the CD unless you downloaded it digitally, and that is increasingly rare these days. And so I like to get a physical copy of the music, and I like to drive around, basically like I did when I was a teenager, because now I've paid $15, $12, or $18, and so I'm not going to multitask while I'm listening to the music. That's the thing with Spotify. It's like we're all busier than we ever have been before. And I think you can put music on, and it just quickly becomes a soundtrack to while you do other things. So if I buy a CD, I really want to give it a chance. And I'd still experience it the way that I used to.
So true. I heard a Genesis song come up from Invisible Touch, the album, and it took me right back to going for rides around town in the winter of 1989 and listening to that entire album
Yeah.
time and time again, as I did with many other cassettes at the time,
Yeah.
CDs eventually, but your on demand selection was limited. So you made that emotional connection with these songs and these albums and these artists. They became like friends of yours. The songs became like best friends. So I wonder how much of that connection is made with younger generation through the streaming services?
Well, so a couple of things on that. One, you and anyone out there could easily disagree with everything I'm saying, right? Um, But my own feeling is, and there's a danger in generalizing, but my feeling is that the art of listening is mostly gone. And so the very experience that you're describing, you're driving around with the car of friends, you'd be talking and joking around, but there was serious listening that went on. I know that was true when, I would have a friend, we'd just drive for hours and it was about taking the music seriously and it was about hearing new things. But also remember, we'd get a new cassette and we might not get another new cassette for like 2 or 3 months because
Sure.
we weren't overwhelmed with new music. And so we had our favorite bands or we had new artists that we would hear about, but it wasn't at the relentless pace that it is now. So it did give us more time to listen and absorb that album more seriously versus like moving on to the next thing because a new album has dropped today, you know.
A big challenge older artists with new music face is summed up with one word: nostalgia. You write, quote, what we hear these days is not even about the music itself anymore. It's that we're more nostalgic for Men at Work than we are for The Clash. And that's what troubles me. Talk about the way our brains are wired to connect with songs from our youth. Really, it has little to do with the quality of the song. Instead, it's more of an emotional connection, like I've just mentioned.
Yeah, well, certainly people could argue otherwise. What I would say is that when we are young, when we're teenagers, you know, everything feels dramatic to us, right? We're trying to figure out who we are. We're having first loves, first crushes. Maybe we're trying to figure out what we're going to do after high school. And so that's one thing. But when we were growing up, there was music, there was always music around us because either MTV was on at the house, or if we had left MTV, then we had the radio on, or if we were at someone's party, then someone had the boombox going, right? And so when those dramatic things happen, when Tina says to you, I really just want to be friends again, or someone is making fun of someone because they got a flock of seagulls haircut, we tend to remember those moments because there's always music going on. And it is not overstating it to say when we're that young and impressionable, the music just gets stamped onto our brains. And so because we're open to letting music form those kinds of associations. They just do. We remember the song that was playing when we were at the prom. You know, our lives get busier for a lot of us. Our lives get busier with now we're in the adult world of jobs, and maybe we get married or we have partners and we start to have children. And it's not that music is necessarily not a part of that. I don't think that that's true, but we have this history now of forming a relationship to all these songs, and now the new songs are competing versus the old songs. And so you can hear new music and you can like it, but you're on some level you are just doing more things. You're different than you were 10 years ago. And your mind has already formed associations with previous songs. And my experience is that you can hear a new album and really love it, but it is harder, which is not to say impossible, but it is harder for that music to form the same kind of emotional attachment that you might have had with earlier albums, where you're just, again, where you're in your formative stage, and those discoveries are thrilling. And at some point, you've made so many discoveries, if, like you and me, people who just consumed music for such a long period of time, and then you become a little bit more selective because there is just one person said to me in the book, it's like the hard drive gets filled up. And that's the challenge. That can happen, but we don't have to let it happen.
You're exactly right. We don't have to let it happen. That's why I try to still listen to new artists, try to find them, seek them out, and see if I like what I hear, which I would say there's one band, which would be Lord Huron from Michigan. Now they're not so much new anymore. They've been around probably
Uh-huh.
15 years, but but I discovered them through a movie, a Robert Redford, Nick Nolte movie where they go hitchhiking together. And they're playing
Huh.
all these songs that just hit me. It struck a chord with me. And that's how I became a fan of them. And now every time I listen to them, I think about that moment. It was an early September afternoon,
Mm.
walking out of the theater that day and saying, "Who is that band, Lord Huron?"
Huh.
So there
Yeah.
are those moments, but it's like it's not as much because a lot of it too, as you get older, you feel like you've heard it before. Just like going to a movie and you say, "Boy, this plot, I feel like I've seen this before." Like
Right.
this is Die Hard, isn't it? It's like,
I mean, the thing
is
that
that
I
the same
wrestle with
thing?
is, so we consume new movies, we binge on new TV shows, and podcasts, but music, in my experience, is the exception. We get really content to keep hearing the same albums, the same music. And, you just think about it with TV, it's not like people sit around and watch Bewitched year after year or Dallas or some of those old shows. I mean, we can watch them for fun sometimes or see how they hold up. But a lot of us are really content to just keep listening to really a pretty select number of songs from the 70s and 80s, just because those songs do something for us. Now, I want to say, um, listening to music is supposed to be fun, so I don't come at any of this with judgment. The whole point of the book is, but all of this has consequences, And so here's what I mean. So if you love a band and that band has been around for a long time, and the band puts out new music, and people don't really want new music so much from that band anymore. So what happens is they don't make very much money off of it. It doesn't sell very much, and they get the message. So in concert, maybe they play one song from their new album, right? And that's kind of their indulgence. And if 3 years ago they make another album, the same thing happens, then at some point they are conscious of the living they want to make. And so at some point, the danger is they say, you know what, people just don't want the new music anymore. We have enough music. And so what happens is then that band will keep touring. They'll probably tour more regularly because they don't make any money making new music anymore. But they will keep playing the same old songs, and maybe they'll change them up in the arrangements. Maybe the sequence will be a little bit different. I just know myself. I want more from concert. I want more from bands whose output is the reason I'm there in the first place. That's not to say that bands who have been around for a while keep making the same level of great music. You and I know that sometimes that is not the case, but for me, like the whole point is the openness of it.
I'm so with you, and I'm so happy. I listened to the Cure's new album, and I love the Cure, and I'm so
Mm,
happy with that album as a whole. And Springsteen still puts out some really
yeah,
good stuff, and
sure.
I think U2 still puts out some really good stuff. I mean, Neil Young he makes an album every year still. He's in his almost 80. And I'm like you, I want that. And I would say as an artist, I don't see why they wouldn't want to continue to create new music just for the sake of the fact that that's who they are. Because like I say, in concert, they must be bored to tears if they have to play the same songs every night the same way. So yeah, it's I don't know that I think that's the danger in where we're heading in the future. And the business end of things, this is where I want to go now. Talk about corporations buying out music, and this is what you write in the book. You say, quote, one major development in recent years that will have a profound impact on the music we'll be hearing in the future, where and how, has been the massive acquisition of artists' catalogs for songwriting, recordings, or both. Can you talk about that? Because I think that's really important. And I know Hall and Oates, that was in the headlines a lot because they were fighting over
Right.
one company buying out all of their publishing. And that's a huge thing because then they no longer have the decision making.
Right. Well, I mean, those artists are, we could say, rightfully making a killing because the kinds of artists who have sold their catalogs in recent years have had an amazing career. Whether you're
I
talking
think
about,
Kiss just recently did.
I mean, so many of them
Yeah.
have, and some have sold them for 50 million or 30 million or 300 million. I mean, the figures are not always available. But it's important to think about what that is about. So these are venture capitalists who are buying this music. So why do they want it? Because they want to find new ways to monetize. that music. And so if we think we hear the old songs from the artists in the 70s and the 80s a lot these days, we're going to hear that music in so many new ways that we don't even have the imagination for just yet because they've spent all this money. So they absolutely intend for that music to pop up everywhere. And it's just from my point of view, that's going to be really overwhelming. But most significantly is it blocks increasingly the space for new music and new artists. My worry is that we're just going to keep hearing that same music over and over, and a lot of it is great and deserves to be heard regularly. But part of what I'm arguing about in the book is where why can't it be moved off the shelf a little bit to make room for music from this century? I so rarely hear music from this century where when I'm ever out in the public sphere, you know. It's a weird thing. If I go into any kind of automotive place, oil change, or I'm getting a part, I always hear the Steve Miller Band.
Oh, yeah. I have a friend who says I just can't listen to Steve Miller anymore. I love Steve Miller, but yeah, it's
But yes, but how much more in your life do you need to hear those songs anymore? Because
yes.
there's so many artists who have made great music since the Steve Miller Band. And so for me, it's part of it is just it's like the equity. Where is the balance? If I'm in Target, you mentioned Men at Work. I always hear Men at Work at Target. They had three studio albums and then dissolved in the 80s. Or I might hear Kim Carnes, Betty Davis Eyes. It's
Yeah.
just there are two McDonald's kind of equidistant to where I live. One plays all 70s music and one plays all 80s music. And so you think, well, why would that be? McDonald's has the most diverse group of diners basically in the world. It's young and old, it's grandparents trying to get the grandson to eat one more chicken McNugget. And it's
Yes.
UPS guys coming in for lunch and it's cheerleaders who've just come in from practice, and it's just an incredible array of America. And and a lot of those people didn't grow up on music in the 70s and 80s. And yet it's so commonplace, they just kind of accept it. I know that if I was hanging out, as I did at McDonald's in the 80s, and they were playing what would be the equivalent then, Cab Calloway and Bing Crosby and Duke Ellington, I would think, what? That's weird. Why are they playing Bing Crosby? But no one gives it any kind of thought. And I think it's just because that's how we've been conditioned. We expect to go in public places and hear music from that era only.
And you do break down the McDonald's music experience in the book, Mood Media. I think that's the name of the company, or
That's
that's
right. That's
yeah.
right.
And you made a list of the songs that you were hearing in these McDonald's. Yeah, that's in the book too. And there was something that happened back in 2014 that convinced you more than anything else that we don't want new music, and that's U2 giving away their album Songs of Experience for free on iTunes. What was it about that specific moment that convinced you more than anything else?
Well, I think it's because at that point, U2 was still a huge band in the world. Now they had gone a couple of albums that they had released a couple albums that hadn't been as impassionately embraced as others, but they were still U2, touring the world and winning Grammys. And so they had hit on this marketing scheme. They were happy with this batch of songs and they said, so they partnered with Apple. They said, hey, we'll give it away for free. And I'm sure at the time that felt like a stroke of genius because no one had done anything like that before. And the response was so dramatic. Basically, people resented that they had an album on there that they didn't ask for. And you think, well, yeah, it's free and it's U2. You don't have to like it. But it was the whole notion that it was new music that they didn't want. That's the thing that I focused on. It was new music that they didn't want because a lot of these people had loved you, or some of those people had loved U2, but hadn't listened to new U2 in a long time. And there was a reason for that you know. And now here was even more new music from U2. And some people made the argument, well, it's taking up space on my device, and it just no, it took up the smallest slice of space possible. It was the idea that it was foisted on them, you know. And so, and then the problem was you couldn't get rid of it very quickly. It was a very hard thing to figure out how to get rid of. And so Apple had to release this statement and said, well, here's how you do it. And even then, people couldn't figure it out. And so there was just this resentment of it. And it, you know, if it had been a band like Five for Fighting, a band, you know, who a lot of people would have said, I don't want new music from them. But because it was free, and because it was from basically the biggest band, you know, you could argue still in the world that at that point, there were a lot of things built into that that just made me think, wow, we really are at a turning point. You didn't pay, they didn't make you pay for it. You know, you got it for free and still you don't want it.
And U2 as a band was always trying to keep their new music relevant. I always noticed that
Yeah,
about them, and it was working. They would push that button. They would keep the U2 sound, but they would push it forward. Of course, with Octave
yeah,
Baby, that was a big thing. You know, they really
huge.
took a
Yeah.
leap on that. But I remember hearing the song Invisible, and they debuted it during the Super Bowl.
Ah,
And I still love that song. And it just came and went. I was like, this is a great song. I remember they used to have their from No Line on the Horizon. They had songs from there on commercials, and you'd hear it in movie theaters or wherever they could get it. They tried everything that they could do,
yeah.
but it just wasn't working. And it's at the
No.
point now where it's kind of a bummer because I mean they're hugely successful with this
Yeah.
tour, the Sphere, but it's it starts to feel now like more of a nostalgic experience.
Well, part of what they did with what U2 has done and so many other bands in getting people excited for the tour, they said we're going to go play this album in full. You know, here's the 30th anniversary of this album. We're going to play it, and people go crazy for that. You know, it's in some ways it's not so dissimilar from all the excitement, less so in this country, but in other parts of the world about Oasis uniting. You know, I mean, it was a long time ago, and people have been waiting for that. They're not going to come out with new music, and I think mostly fans will be entirely content with that. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just what is that but more nostalgia.
Yeah. I just keep thinking of like the Black Crowes new album. Loved it,
Yeah, I
you
love
know,
that
but people,
album.
yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
The Stones with that new album they put out, Hackney Diamonds, it's just like, wow, this is way above what I was expecting from the Stones. I was hoping to maybe
Yeah.
get a few good songs, but the whole thing was just this is the Stones. This is the Stones at their best at the age of 80. I mean, you can't get any
Right.
better than this. And it just kind of came and went. And yeah, but there are artists though that this was impressive. Nancy Wilson of Heart, she talked to you for the book because a lot of
Uh,
artists didn't want to talk about it because it's probably just it just for them they just probably it's I don't know it just probably pisses them off that people don't want to hear the music,
well,
but
it's a delicate, you know, it's a delicate question that I was posing to them.
Nancy was honest with you. She was
Yeah.
kind of she was just kind of sympathetic to the older Heart fans, like she gets it.
She was very sympathetic, and also what was true for her and Jonathan Cain of Journey, who I talked to, and also
Right.
Steve Howe. Yes, they don't resent that fans love this music so much. They appreciate that fans love this music. It doesn't mean that they don't want to create new music. All of them do. Although Jonathan Cain said that maybe he felt like Journey had made the last of the new music because the fans don't want to hear it. But they do love that music, at least the three of them, and the way they talked about it. They understand that their fans are at a different place in life. And I think Nancy Wilson described their famous songs as being like cozy, you know, sweatpants putting those on because it just hearing Magic Man or Crazy on You, it just gives them a comfort that new music is less likely to give. And I don't think there was a bitterness at all about that. It was an acceptance. And also, you know, a band like Heart has had an amazing career. So they may release some new music, but they love playing live. And they have a whole range of songs that they can play, you know. But yeah, I think most artists there were a lot of artists that I contacted or tried to reach to speak to that question, and I think there's an uncomfortable truth in it, you know.
David Rowell is the author of The Endless Refrain, Memory, Nostalgia, and the Threat to New Music. Another interesting interview, Jason Hanley, who's the vice president of education and visitor engagement at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. He told you, quote, the pace of society is so quick, we consume things at a rate that is unparalleled in the history of humanity, where Dark Side of the Moon might have been the only album that I could afford in a 6-month period. What would happen if Dark Side of the Moon were released today, like during the Spotify era? That's what I wonder. Would it just come and
Well,
go and be
I
forgotten?
think that for 2 to 3 weeks, all the music bloggers and people who have podcast shows would make a huge deal of it. And in 3 weeks, we would have moved on to the next thing. And then, um, it's like back when Dark Side of the Moon was released, it was so much more than just a new album. It had a hold on the culture for decades. It's a brilliant musical statement from start to finish. And but it just I think that new music does compete with so many things these days, but I also think that we don't want to spend time with new music the way that we once did because there's so many different artists and it just comes at you so intensely. I mean, the challenge in the Spotify era is there's just an endless sea of music out there, and how do you even go about making new discoveries if you don't want to go along with all the suggestions that it makes? And because it takes such effort to do that, I think increasingly it's just easy for us to stay where we are with it.
That
So,
just hurts my heart to hear that, but it's so true.
yes.
Dark Side of the Moon be 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks tops, and it would just drop off. It's,
Well, I might be
it's,
wrong, but I
I
feel like that's what happens.
yeah, no, it's true. It's so true. And you're talking about an album that was on the Billboard charts for a record, I don't know how many years straight. It's just, it's
But I
mind
mean, it
boggling.
speaks to so, but think about it like this. Journey's Greatest Hits album, which was released in the late 80s, has been on the album chart for 800 some weeks, 830 some weeks. And so what does that tell us? But that we want to keep hearing, that new generations want to keep hearing that music, that was made then. And so on the one hand, there's hope for new people discovering Dark Side of the Moon, but we're talking about music that was made then. If it was released now, it's a whole it's um it comes out differently. It doesn't get released with the sense of aura and all that it has because people understand what Dark Side of the Moon is. That is one of the biggest albums in the history of rock. If and so they can listen very respectfully and carefully to it. But there's something about a new artist releasing, if Pink Floyd was a new band and released this as a new album, I think we greet it with our 21st century um attitudes, which is we might listen to it for a little while, but then we move on quickly because that's what we do now.
In terms of older artists playing new songs in concert, I have a theory. I'd love to know what you think about this. The
Uh-huh.
placement of a song, a new song, I think the most adrenaline and excitement is felt when that show just starts. I mean, that's when you're really just excited.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I feel like that's the time to play a new song, as long as it's high energy. Because to me, if the Stones open with "Angry," right, new song from
Yeah.
Hackney
Yeah.
Diamonds, and I'm 20 years old, and I went to the show because hey, I was just curious because this is the Stones. I know a lot of the songs. I've heard of them. And then you hear "Angry" open the show, you might make more of a connection to it. Is that
Yeah.
wishful thinking, or what do
Well,
you think?
no, I think it basically that's a
Instead of
bold
burying it in the
statement.
middle, just
Yeah, yeah.
people.
I mean, and just to be clear, there are artists like Peter Gabriel was playing that whole album of the collection of new songs from last year before it was even out yet. He was releasing one song a month. And so there are artists who believe so strongly in their new music. David Gilmour just played Madison Square Garden, and I believe that he played all of the new album.
Oh, that's great because it's a solid, really solid album.
It's
Huge
terrific. And
Gilmore fan.
so, but remember also David Gilmour said that he, in the beginning of promoting that tour, he said he wasn't going to play Pink Floyd material that Roger Waters had played on. He was just going to play the last couple of Pink Floyd album music from those albums. And that he got so much backlash that he basically had to walk that back. And so, you know, one, that music is brilliant. The Pink Floyd music made from those four guys, Rick Wright and Nick Mason and David Gilmour and Roger Waters. But also the sense of nostalgia came through so strongly because there was an uproar that he said he wasn't going to play that music. Dave Gilmour has now had quite a few solo albums, certainly enough to fill a concert.
Sure.
But so he's been bold in playing that new music because he clearly believes in it. But he certainly fills it out with classic Pink Floyd material too.
Yeah, I think the audience that it depends on the artist because
Yes,
a jam band audience is always going to welcome whatever you play in like Dave Matthews
that's right.
band. A coworker of mine went to go see Dave Matthews. He talked about seeing back-to-back nights, different set lists, and that's what that fan base wants. So it
Right,
depends
right.
also on that. Depends on that. Yeah, I know Sammy Hagar. You probably could see the Van Halen
I
banner
do.
behind me. So Sammy, he's had solid tours since he
Yeah.
left Van Halen, but this past summer he's got one of the biggest, highest grossing tours of the summer of the year, and it's because he's playing mostly Van Halen songs. Again, nostalgia
Yeah.
for me. I was in the second row, so I'm in Connecticut. All the memories come back. It's like I'm watching Michael Anthony right there on bass, Sammy singing the songs, and just brought back all the great memories. So that's there's a lot to be said for that. A lot to be
Well,
said
yeah.
for
I saw an incredible
familiar
concert
songs.
recently from a band calling themselves Beat. It has two members of the 80s King Crimson era,
Oh
Tony
yeah,
Levin on bass, Adrian Belew on guitar, and they've recruited Steve Vai to play Robert Fripp's parts
get
and
out.
Carey
Tony Levin on bass, Stevie Vai.
Danny Carey from Tool on drums playing Bill Bruford's part.
Oh
And they were
wow,
playing the three classic King Crimson albums from the 80s, which are some of my very favorites. And that has been a hugely successful tour.
wow. I'd love to see that. I don't know if they're
Oh,
coming
it's
around my
tremendous.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, Stevie Vai is. I'm a huge Stevie Vai fan. Yeah,
Yeah.
you get into tribute bands in the book.
Yeah.
Even the original band, quote unquote, may not have all the members in there, like with Foreigner now with Mick Jones, his health problems. It's no original members.
For Leonard Skinner, no original member.
Skinner, Journey, Foreigner, Styx, very successful, yet without their original singer or even any of the band members. And I love your line in the book. You say the shows feel like sitting on a mall Santa's lap as an adult. No one is being fooled, but it can still be comforting. Do we connect more with the band name than and the songs than the members themselves?
Well, I think that I'm in the minority of really caring these days who's in the band, you know.
We're so like it's like your favorite player on a team. You remember
Right,
the backup
right.
shortstop. You know who it is on the Red Sox. Yeah,
But I mean, tribute bands are a very big deal these days, and so that can't be dismissed. They are a big part of the concert industry, but let's think about that in a couple of ways. One, there's no more surefire way to avoid hearing new music than going to a tribute act. They're not, they are almost never going to play a song from this century, and and that is fine with a whole lot of people. And again, I don't have judgment about that, but it does say something that tribute bands have become that important that we just want to keep hearing the songs, and we want to hear them from people wearing wigs, trying to look like the previous band. I mean, if that's not some deep-seated nostalgia, then I don't know what is. And some of the tribute bands can be, really great. I mean, there are so many. So I went and spent a week with a Journey tribute band in Florida, and I went to Florida because there are more Journey tribute bands than there are Arby's. They are everywhere.
Yeah.
And it just speaks to Journey's the music that Journey, the stronghold that that music has on us. And so, and also remember, you're not dealing with parking assholes. You for at a venue that's hosting a tribute band, generally that's a pretty straightforward thing. You park in the parking lot and that's it. You're maybe paying $40 or
Yes.
$45, not 175, and then not another additional $80 of fees you don't even understand. So it's a less complicated exchange. And if those bands are really good, then then you've gotten the satisfaction of hearing those songs played live, even though it's someone who sounds like Steve Perry, someone who sounds like Neil Sean. For a lot of people, that is enough these days.
Yeah. I was talking with Gary Graff, a rock journalist from Detroit, great writer. He just released a book on the 90s. And we were
Hmm,
talking about the law that allowed corporations to buy out endless amounts of radio stations. It led to very homogenous programming. And
sure.
I worked in radio in the 90s right up to the around right about 2015, 2016. So I was there during that change, and it wasn't a good change. At some point, it just lost its luster. How have the changes in radio programming affected the way we connect with music since the 90s, in your opinion?
Ooh, boy, radio programming. I mean, everyone I talked to in the book just said radio was dead.
Yeah.
I think it's very hard to find, as I spin the radio dial, it's very hard to even hear new music.
Yeah.
There's so many oldies stations. Um, so, I mean, I know that there are some stations there, but I find it hard to even find them. Maybe that's more true of rock and pop. Um, but it's not how these artists discover new fans generally, you know.
Because I
Um,
just think part of the reason why we are where we are right now is because in the 90s, starting in the 90s into the early 2000s, because I witnessed it when these artists would come out with new music and the program directors would just say, nah, we're not going to bother. And I would be shocked. Like Springsteen would have a new album out and he'd have a great song.
hmm.
Now we're just going to stick with, Born in the USA and Born to Run and
Well,
Dancing in the
part of
Dark.
what the area you're describing also is around the time of the collapse of the music industry. And so the ways that songs used to be put on the radio, and you had a whole team, an army of publicists and people working the radio stations, sometimes making trips to the radio station and shaking hands and saying, "We're really excited about this new album. We really want you to give it a chance, and we know your listeners will love it." I mean, that whole landscape has changed so radically. For the labels that do exist today, everything is about Spotify for them.
I just felt like the radio business when I was in it, I felt like we still have a chance to try to make a difference. Like let's familiarize these fans with the legendary artist's new music and the new bands play their music and let's familiarize them with it because if you don't do that, then I mean these songs just go into the abyss. But maybe it's radio is always responding to the tests. They would do the audience testing. So
Right,
there's
right.
their argument would be, or their defense would be, we're just playing what the people are telling us they want to hear.
Well, so when I was growing up and making all these discoveries, if there was a hit video, then you couldn't turn on the radio and not hear that song. And if there was a pop hit, then you better bet that there was a video for it. And so for me, that becomes a really a level of musical repetition that starts to have significant consequences because we heard the same songs over and over. Remember, MTV starts off with not a long list of videos. There were artists like Springsteen and Billy Joel who didn't know what to make of this and didn't really think that they should have to bother with music videos. REM didn't want to make music videos. And so we heard, but then there was this whole wave of new artists who were perfect for that. Duran Duran and the Eurythmics and Madonna, and they weren't established musical entities, and so they just happened to have a look and an aesthetic, and they knew what to do. So you could put a group like Duran Duran on a yacht, and people would be excited, and people would watch that because they had the right look for that. And so, but it just meant that we just kept hearing those songs. And so I really feel like decades later now, 2024, part of it is we hear those songs that we heard constantly, and it's not even a matter of like listening to the song anymore. It's almost like a bell being struck, and we have a response to it. We were conditioned to hearing that song so often that it just takes us back. And it's not about how that was just the greatest guitar solo. It's just, it takes us back to who we were then before things got more complicated.
Yeah.
It's, we have a warmer feeling because that's before the kids in therapy. And
Yes.
that's before the fish black at the holiday Christmas party that sings "Don't Worry, Be Happy," and it's before the taking a job, at a startup company that didn't. There's just more complicated things happen to us because that is life, and so there is for some people. When I just heard this time and time again during the reporting that music is the most important to them because it's the most innocent time. It's before things got difficult and scary. And so it is truly like comfort food.
Sure. It is cool to see when you're at these shows and you see the responses from people once a song kicks in, or even on concert, just being somewhere at a McDonald's or wherever you are, and you just see somebody go, "Oh my God, I remember this," this, and they just have that expression, like it just immediately takes them back to when they were 16 years old.
Well, so before I went to see, spend time with the Journey Tribute Band, I went to see the real Journey because I thought I should, just as a way to compare. And by the way, the original, I mean, the Journey that I saw had one more original member than the tribute band. So, but seeing the reaction to Never Stop Believing, and the thing that was so shocking was that they played it as their third song.
Oh, don't stop believing. Yes, yes, yes.
But that crowd, and so some people were still coming in, but the reaction to that was about the most dramatic thing I've ever seen in live music. And
Instant.
they're screaming those lyrics with I mean, truly trying to lose their vocal cords forever. I mean, that's what it is for people to hear that song and songs like and again, a select number of songs like that, but anthems that people can never want to stop hearing.
Yeah, so true. And then when it appeared in The Sopranos, it's got a whole new audience.
Boy, it did. And then Journey releases they find a singer on YouTube, and that's a moving story because that singer is coming from homelessness and other difficult issues. And so Journey has this amazing ride. Journey was eligible for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for so many years, and they were never nominated. And then the first year they get nominated after what you're describing, the Sopranos episode, then they sail right in. And tellingly, they let Journey close the show. So it was the Rock and Roll. I think it was Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's way of recognizing that they had maybe missed the boat for many years because that fan base was clamoring for Journey to get that kind of official recognition.
This is a quote from Jonathan Cain in the book. Music back in our era was designed to lift you and to melodically hook you. In other words, make you feel something, whatever it was. So our music from the 80s and 90s, and I'd even put the 70s in there, was all intended to entertain, to romance you, to woo you, to make you feel something. We were trying to sell a feeling. With that, is the problem also the newer rock bands? Are they just not making music that's good enough?
Well, that's certainly what he was arguing. He had an interesting point. He said our music is certain music for uncertain times. And there were several people in the book that said that the pandemic made a lot of people feel like it was too impossible to envision the future. And so the response to that was, well, if there's not going to be a future, I'm going to embrace what I remember going through or what I had a relationship to before. So you and I were talking before we started up the interview. Um, there is great rock music being played, but it's harder to hear it these days because pop music really is dominating, in all kinds of ways, and hip hop certainly does. But there's like Jack White just released a new album, very recently, and that's an amazing rock album.
I haven't listened to it. I got to give it a listen.
It's so terrific, and so you have to be more willful about finding if rock music is your thing, but to finding it. I think Jonathan Cain was feeling like there was so much less of a emphasis on melody these days, but it's much more about um, rhythm. And he felt like he was arguing that in Journey songs, the lyrics told stories. And he was saying he doesn't hear storytelling anymore in lyrics.
I want to wind down with holograms and avatars, which you address in the book, which I'm so glad you did, because this is
Mm.
another huge topic. With Kiss, they're planning on concerts with avatar versions of themselves. So it's a little different. Holograms, these are musicians who are no longer with us, and they're projected on stage as if they are with us. One, are you okay with this from an ethical standpoint? And two, if so, are they at all worth going to see? Are they entertaining
Yeah.
people enough for them to come back?
Well, so I did struggle with the idea of ethics and holograms before I spent time with people who were making them. The thing that really got my attention at the beginning was there was going to be an Amy Winehouse hologram tour, and this was really not many years after she had died, and she died a tragic death. And so at that point, I knew that there was a Roy Orbison tribute act and some others, and so the more I came to know about the hologram show, I just got more at peace with seeing it as what's just totally your choice, and it depends on what's important to you in live music. I mean, no one goes to these shows and looks at Buddy Holly and says, "Wait a minute, why is he so bright?" You know he's dead. So you've paid a ticket. You're not being fooled. And what some of these shows are counting on is what it is to see the hologram surrounded by live musicians. That was true with the Whitney Houston hologram and the Dio
Dio,
hologram
Ronnie
and
James
Frank
Dio.
Zappa.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in some of those cases, in the case of the Dio show and the Frank Zappa show, those were musicians who had played with those deceased artists. So for fans, that did mean a lot. Um, but those shows had not been huge money makers. I saw them in venues that were all less than 1,000 people, and what was a big kick for the hologram industry was the ABBA show. The ABBA show was huge. Now remember, those four members are all alive, but they had avatars, and so it wasn't just the member, the musician there on stage, but they were flying all around and doing all kinds of different things. And I think that sketched out some new possibilities. So that's what the Kiss show will be. And even though the Kiss thing was a pretty well guarded secret, in the scheme of things, who in the world was surprised that there was going to be a continuation of Kiss concerts? Because why? Because why would we ever stop listening to Kiss music? That isn't that the idea?
Sure.
Why would we ever stop listening?
You're
And
talking to a member of the Kiss Army here. I would put him in my top five.
I will tread carefully, but I'm just saying, uh, they it toured forever, and And the only way that we'll experience that music now is to see it. And obviously, Kiss is on board because they cooperated with everything. So in that way, it's not really a question of ethics. They're doing it. No
Right.
one's taking their music. It's is that going to be a satisfying experience? And that just depends on who you are, you know?
I don't know. I really can't say one way or the other. I'm very curious as a huge Kiss fan. I just don't know if it's going to work or not. And it's going to be a while. I think they said, I
Yeah,
think 2026, maybe even 2027, it'll be ready to roll out,
right.
and we'll see.
I mean, right. So the question is, will their fans have had enough of Live Kiss, Or do they really want a whole new way to experience Kiss? And we won't know until that show comes out.
But if it works, other artists, other companies will really want to do it. If it doesn't, then
That's right. Because it will stop being a case of just dead musicians' estates, but musicians who have said, I can't keep doing this or I don't want to keep doing this. And I mean, the larger point is they want their musical legacies intact. So you can't, you can't blame them for that. Um, it's just it all for me. It all comes back to what does that say about our relationship to new music? And so something like that says, well, our relationship to new music is shaky at best.
what do you think about AI in music, creating new music, original songs being created that sound as if they were recorded by the artists themselves?
I mean, I've heard some samples that are astonishingly good, and I'm pretty old school on this. I mean, I understand there may come the time where there's a new Beatles album, and it's because it was all AI manufactured, and maybe that becomes some interesting listening experience. I think the thing that I would worry about long from now is making sure everyone understands the distinction between who the Beatles really were versus Beatles AI music. I mean, if they can do interesting things with that, then that's new music. But when it's a careful study of Beatles music, and I guess I would be open to that. But what about the new bands who just want to make new great music themselves? Isn't that where we really should be putting our attention? We had the Beatles. The Beatles changed everything, and those albums will always be there. I don't know if we need new Beatles music created not by any of the Beatles.
Yeah, what we need is, as far as rock and roll, you need a band that can write great music, but is also the music that your parents don't want you listening to.
Yeah, music
Right?
that will
It's not
last.
dangerous anymore. That's the thing.
No, it's not.
That I'll finish with this question. Leads right into the question. We've heard people say rock and roll is dead. Is this true, or is there hope for the future?
Well, I think that there are a lot of ways to take measure of that. I think that the stronghold of nostalgia means that rock music is very alive in some ways, but it's museum music. It's music that has been preserved and it's the new deluxe edition and so many different ways to repackage what we already know. I think that there are bands who are creating vibrant new music and they're competing against all the predecessors that came before them. They're competing with the bands that influence them, even if those bands are not still around or alive, because that music is just we can't get enough of it. So I think that yes, you can say, I mean, that Jack White album I think is a great example. That's the best new rock record I've heard in a long time, and it made me feel hopeful, you know.
And I would say, as long as there's the possibility of one kid in that audience who goes to see Jack White, who's looking up on that stage saying, I want to do that,
Yeah.
he could be the next brilliant artist to bring rock and roll back. So
Yeah.
there's always that possibility. It's always there. And I'll say this, regardless, between the mid 60s and mid 90s, some of the greatest rock and roll music ever recorded. And that's a long time. So I'm thankful that we have that much that we can tap into.
Right. There's just
Yeah.
no reason to think that we can't have so much great music in this century. And I think that we do. I think we just have to be very dedicated to giving it a chance.
Yeah. And I'll even go further back now to the mid 50s. I'm starting to get into all that stuff, the Buddy Hollies and all those guys too. I mean, there's so much out there. The Endless Refrain, Memory, Nostalgia, and the Threat to New Music is out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. And where can people find you online, David?
So I have my website, davidrowellauthor.com.
Got a link to that. I'll put it in the show notes so people can
Great.
check out
Thanks.
the website. David, thank you so much.
Oh, Eric, it was great fun talking to you about all this. Thank you.